If you look at a machine, you expect it to wear out, the gears grind down, the parts loosen, and eventually the whole thing just stops working. For a long time, we thought our bodies worked the same way. That aging was simply the inevitable result of the friction of living. But the biology tells a much more complicated story, and it leaves us with a fundamental question. Is aging a programmed biological certainty, or is it just a series of accumulating errors? To answer that, we have to look at the individual cells that make us up. In 1961, a biologist named Hayflick made a discovery that changed how we view our own mortality. Before Hayflick, there was a popular idea that normal human cells were essentially immortal, that if you kept them in a controlled environment, they would just keep dividing forever. But Hayflick found that wasn't true. He observed that a population of normal human fetal cells would only divide about 40 to 60 times before they hit a hard limit. After that, they entered a state called senescence, a kind of cellular retirement where they stop dividing entirely. This Hayflick limit has led some to suggest that our cells have a built-in countdown. It's an idea that aging might not just be something that happens to us from the outside, but something happening at a fundamental biological level. However, researchers caution that while the aging of cell populations appears to correlate with the physical aging of an organism, it isn't a proven biological law. But this raises a massive question. If such a limit exists, why would it be there? Why wouldn't we have evolved to keep our cells dividing indefinitely? One way scientists try to answer this is through the disposable soma theory. Formulated by biologist Thomas Kirkwood, this theory proposes that aging is the result of evolutionary trade-offs. Think of it like a biological budget. An organism has a finite amount of energy and resources to spend. It can invest those resources into growth and reproduction, making sure the next generation survives, or it can invest them into maintenance, like repairing DNA and fixing cellular damage. The theory suggests that evolution might favor the first option. The idea is that if an organism spends all its energy on perfect, long-term maintenance, it might not have enough left to reproduce quickly or effectively. So, the body prioritizes the now growth and reproduction and leaves the later, the long-term repair, to fend for itself. Over time, this lack of investment could lead to the accumulation of mutations, shortened telomeres, and the cellular senescence Hayflick observed. In this view, our individual bodies, our soma, are somewhat disposable once we've passed our genes on. Of course, this is still a work in progress. While many models support this idea of a trade-off, the scientific community is still debating the specifics. We don't yet have a consensus on exactly how much reproduction drives aging, and the specific cellular mechanisms that govern these decisions remain largely undiscovered. What we do have are clocks. Researchers use something called epigenetic clocks, measuring specific patterns of DNA methylation to track biological age with incredible accuracy. These clocks can tell us how much wear and tear is actually happening in our systems, moving us closer to understanding whether we are simply running out of time or if we are living out a very old, very deliberate biological plan. If epigenetic clocks can track the wear and tear on our entire bodies, researchers are now trying to see if we can do the same for the organ that defines us, the brain. This is where the concept of brain age comes in. It isn't just a metaphor. By using machine learning to analyze brain imaging, researchers can estimate a brain age score, essentially comparing your actual brain structure to what a computer expects a brain of your chronological age to look like. A long-term study of nearly 900 people from the Dunedin cohort has shown that this number matters a great deal. Researchers found that a person's brain age at age 45 was a reliable predictor of their cognitive health later in life. If your brain age was higher than your actual age in midlife, you were more likely to experience cognitive decline in adulthood. But perhaps most striking is that these associations can be traced much further back. The study suggested that higher brain age scores at age 45 were associated with impaired brain health as early as age 3, implying that brain age might reflect variations in the central nervous system that had been present since childhood, rather than just age-related deterioration. This brings us to the question of why some people seem to stay sharp while others begin to slip much earlier. We know that cognitive decline, things like slower processing speed or lapses in memory, can actually begin in early adulthood. But the reasons why we differ are incredibly complex and, frankly, difficult to pin down. We know that genetics, diet, lifestyle, and even chronic inflammation play a role. But many studies find that the impact of any single factor is relatively small. There is also the question of direction. Does poor cognitive health cause certain lifestyle choices, or do those choices cause the decline? While we struggle to isolate a single cause, scientists are looking at a specific biological process that might be driving the actual deterioration. It involves something called cellular senescence. As we age, some cells stop dividing, but they don't die. Instead, they enter a sort of zombie state. They linger in our tissues, secreting inflammatory signals that can damage the healthy cells around them. In the brain, research suggests that the accumulation of these senescent cells may drive neurodegeneration, potentially contributing to the progression of diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and multiple sclerosis. This is a significant problem because currently, many of the high-profile clinical trials aimed at treating these diseases have failed to show results. We have been targeting the symptoms or the end-stage damage rather than the underlying cellular exhaust that might be driving the fire. If the brain age scores we see in midlife are truly a window into our future, they might offer something more than just a warning. They could serve as a biomarker, a way to test whether new interventions, perhaps aimed at clearing out these senescent cells, are actually working before the damage becomes irreversible. We are moving from asking how much time we have left to asking if we can change the pace at which our brains move through it. But if we want to change the pace of that biological clock, we have to look beyond the cell. Because the body doesn't age in a vacuum. It ages in a world of specific places, specific economies, and specific histories. There is a growing consensus among public health researchers that medical care alone, the doctors, the prescriptions, the hospital visits, is simply not enough to close the gaps in how long or how well we live. To understand why, you have to look upstream. In public health, downstream refers to the things we see in a clinic, a person's blood pressure, their smoking habits, or their diet. But upstream refers to the forces that shape those behaviors before a person ever steps into a doctor's office. We're talking about economic resources, the quality of education, and the weight of systemic racial discrimination. These aren't just social issues, they are the forces that fundamentally shape the behaviors and health outcomes that follow. This connection between our environment and our biology is often described as the long arm of childhood. It's the idea that the socio-emotional conditions of our earliest years reach forward through decades, shaping our health trajectories well into adulthood. The experiences we have when we are young, the stability of our homes, the stress levels of our caregivers, the resources available to our families, don't just disappear when we grow up. They leave a mark on our physiological systems, influencing how we might age decades later. This brings us to a striking reality in the United States. Where you live might matter as much as how you live. If you look at the data at a county level, the map of American longevity is incredibly fragmented. There are gaps in life expectancy between different counties that exceed 20 years. When researchers look at why one zip code sees much older, healthier populations than the one next to it, they don't just find a difference in lifestyle choices. They find deep, structural patterns. The factors most strongly associated with how long a community lives are income, educational attainment, and labor market stability. It is tempting to look at these disparities and attribute them to individual choices, the idea that people in certain areas simply make different decisions about their health. But many researchers argue this is a reductionist way to view the problem. They suggest that things like race and ethnicity often act as markers for cumulative structural disadvantage. In this view, choice is constrained by the environment. It's not just about individual zip codes either, it's about the state-level policies that govern them. Decisions regarding healthcare access, labor protections, and environmental regulations have long-term associations with how long a population survives. So, when we ask if we can change the pace of aging, the answer might depend on more than just a new drug to clear out cellular waste. It might depend on the stability of a person's job, the safety of their neighborhood, and the opportunities they were given before they even reached adulthood. If the biological clock is the engine, then the social and geographic environment is the terrain we navigate. And that terrain is anything but smooth or even. But even if the terrain is smooth, the engine itself can change. When we talk about aging, we often use words that sound like they mean the same thing. Aging, getting sick, getting weak. But in medicine, there is a crucial distinction between simply growing older and becoming frail. To understand that, we have to untangle 3 different ways a body can change. First, there is comorbidity. This is a clinical way of saying a person is managing multiple conditions at once, perhaps diabetes alongside heart disease. It's a tally of diagnoses. Then there is disability. This refers to the functional limits a person faces, like difficulty walking a certain distance or needing help with daily tasks. And then there is frailty. This is different from both. Geriatric medicine increasingly views frailty as its own distinct state. It isn't just a list of diseases, and it isn't just a limitation in movement. Instead, think of it as the gradual loss of the body's inbuilt reserves. When you are young, your body has a massive buffer. If you get a bad flu or a minor infection, your system can absorb that hit, fight back, and return to baseline. But as frailty sets in, that buffer thins out. You become more vulnerable to minor stresses. An unexpected change in your environment, or a simple infection that a younger person would shrug off, might be enough to trigger a significant decline in a frail person. It often shows up physically through things like muscle weakness, slower walking speeds, or even unintentional weight loss. It can also show up emotionally, as those living with frailty often report higher levels of anxiety and depression. It's estimated that between 12 and 24% of people over the age of 50 experience this loss of reserve, though those numbers shift depending on where you live and how you measure it. The most important thing to understand, however, is that this trajectory isn't a fixed, inevitable law of biology. Frailty is not a mandatory part of getting older. The research suggests we can actually influence how this unfolds. We know that a sedentary lifestyle spending much of our later years in inactivity can lead to the premature onset of frailty and disease. But we also know that regular physical activity is safe, even for those who are already frail. Moving the body, whether through low-intensity walking or more vigorous resistance exercises, can help maintain mobility and independence, and it can even help reverse some of the effects of chronic disease. Nutrition plays a similar role. Malnutrition is a significant contributor to the loss of those vital bodily reserves. So, while the biological clock is always ticking, the terrain we travel on isn't just determined by the engine or the environment outside. It's also shaped by how we maintain the machine itself. By distinguishing between the diseases we have, the tasks we can no longer do, and the underlying loss of our physical reserves, doctors and researchers are finding better ways to target care, trying to ensure that as we age, we aren't just surviving, but maintaining the capacity to meet the small, unexpected stresses of life. But the machine doesn't just wear down at the same rate for everyone. If we look at the data, a strange pattern emerges, something researchers call the sex frailty paradox. On the surface, it's a contradiction. Women generally live longer than men, yet they often experience higher rates of disability and frailty. They appear to be more susceptible to the physical breakdown that comes with age, even as they outlast their male counterparts. To understand why these two timelines, longevity and frailty, don't move in sync, researchers are looking at a concept called inflammatory aging. This isn't a sudden event, but a slow, chronic, low-grade inflammatory state that builds up in the body over decades. The theory is that this inflammation doesn't develop at the same pace in men and women. If the biological processes driving inflammation and aging move at different speeds, it could explain why women might face a higher lifetime risk of conditions like Alzheimer's or more significant physical decline, even with a longer total lifespan. This biological shift is often tied to the menopausal transition, a period that acts as a major pivot point for female health. It is a time of profound change, and the evidence shows it is closely associated with shifts in several key areas: cardiovascular health, bone density, sleep, mood, and even how women perceive their own cognitive function. Now, there is a distinction here that's important to get right. While these shifts are clearly linked to menopause, many researchers caution that we shouldn't assume menopause is a direct independent driver that accelerates the aging process itself. Instead, it might be that menopause and chronological aging are moving together, creating a complex overlap of risk. For those looking for ways to manage these transitions, medical reviews suggest that hormone therapy can be highly effective for managing vasomotor symptoms, like hot flashes, and can help reduce the risk of fractures. However, current evidence doesn't support using it as a primary way to prevent dementia or heart disease. But the challenges of aging aren't just written in hormones or inflammatory markers, they are also shaped by the life lived before them. For many women, the experience of aging is inseparable from the social and economic pressures they've navigated. In a study of women over 60 working in lower paid or part-time roles, researchers found a recurring theme of feeling invisible. These women reported feeling excluded or overlooked in the workplace, yet many expressed that they didn't actually view themselves as old. It's a reminder that the health span we talk about isn't just a biological metric. It is also a product of accumulated life stress and systemic inequalities. When we talk about why women face different health challenges as they age, we have to look at the whole picture: the biological shifts of menopause, the theoretical ways our immune systems age, and the social reality of how much stress a body has been carrying for 60 years. If the stress of 60 years of labor is etched into the body, it is also often reflected in how the world chooses to see, or fails to see, the person carrying it. We've been talking about how health span is shaped by systemic inequalities, and one of the most pervasive, yet often unspoken, ways those inequalities manifest is in the workplace. There is a specific kind of erasure that happens as we age, particularly for women. It isn't always a sudden door being slammed; more often, it is a slow, quiet fading. Research into workplace ageism suggests that discrimination often isn't an overt act, but a series of implicit, subconscious biases. It's the assumption that an older worker might be less motivated, or that they are too expensive to employ, or that they are simply too set in their ways to learn new technologies. These are often unfounded assumptions, yet they create a professional environment where experience is treated as a liability rather than an asset. For women, this experience is compounded by a specific kind of gendered ageism. In many professional spheres, there is a cultural expectation that a woman's value is tied to a very narrow window of youth and vitality. As that window shifts, many women report a profound sense of becoming invisible. They have spent decades contributing to their workplaces, building institutional knowledge, and navigating complex social dynamics, only to find that the more they age, the less they are consulted, the less they are trained, and the less they are seen. This invisibility becomes even more acute when age intersects with disability. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has raised alarms about how our legal and social systems often fail to account for the lived experience of disability in later life. There is a documented invisibility in law and in practice regarding how aging and disability collide. When a person is navigating the physical realities of aging alongside a disability, they face an aggravated form of discrimination. They risk being viewed not as contributors, but as a burden or as less deserving of resources, especially during times of economic scarcity. This creates a precarious economic reality. We know there is a high correlation between disability and poverty, and for those in lower-paid roles, the margin for error is razor-thin. If you are working a job that offers little stability, and you are facing the combined pressures of ageism and a changing physical capacity, the workplace can feel less like a community and more like a place where you are being phased out before you are ready. It changes the very nature of social connection. For some, the workplace is a key source of social integration. When that professional identity is stripped away, either through forced retirement, the inability to keep up with shifting technological demands, or the simple loss of being seen, the isolation can be profound. We see this reflected in the ways people seek connection elsewhere, like the older adults in New York City who rely on daily gossip in local eateries to monitor the well-being of their peers. It is a way of staying tethered to the world when the formal structures of work and society have begun to look right through you. This need for a social tether, whether it's a local eatery in New York or a village square in India, is what keeps the experience of aging from becoming one of total isolation. But the shape of those tethers is changing. In the village of Chengalpattu in Tamil Nadu, the social circles of an older adult often look like a series of concentric rings. At the center are the immediate ties, spouses and children, who provide the essential day-to-day emotional and financial support that keeps a person functional. Just outside that is the extended family, the aunts, uncles and cousins who step in for hospital visits or to bring a meal during an emergency. And on the outermost edge are the neighbors and formal caregivers, providing logistical help or a bit of extra cash when the family isn't around. For many rural elders in these communities, the presence of children is more than just practical, it is emotional. One elder in the study described time spent with their children as medicine for their well-being. But even in these traditional structures, the lines are blurring. As children migrate for work, many parents find themselves living in a state of virtual connection, receiving financial support and messages via WhatsApp, but lacking physical presence. In urban areas, this distance is often filled by digital life, with elders turning to gaming apps or online content to combat the loneliness of a household that feels too quiet. This tension between tradition and the reality of modern life is playing out on a massive scale across Asia. In India, the demographic shift is accelerating. The country has one of the fastest aging populations on the planet, with the percentage of older adults already reaching 8.57%, and even higher in states like Kerala, where it exceeds 12%. As fertility rates decline and the traditional extended family structure begins to fray, there is a growing concern that the bedrock of family-based care is being pulled out from under the elderly. We see a similar, though perhaps more complex, transformation in China. For generations, the assumption was that the elderly would be cared for by their children within the same household. But a 2022 study of nearly 10,000 Chinese adults over the age of 60 suggests that the traditional model is no longer the default. In fact, more than 45% of those surveyed reported a preference not to live with their children. The reasons for this shift are not uniform. They are deeply tied to how a person lives and what they have left them. The study found that people who were married, had more education, or had received community services were actually less likely to choose to live with their children. Conversely, those living in rural areas, or those receiving regular visits and financial support from their kids, were more likely to remain in a multi-generational home. What this suggests is that the choice to live alone or in professional care isn't just a rejection of family. It's often a response to changing economic realities and a desire for different kinds of support. As income levels rise and urban life becomes more demanding, living with children is no longer the only option. It is becoming one of many. This leaves us with a profound question about the social contract of aging. If the family is no longer the primary or even the preferred caregiver, what takes its place? Some researchers suggest that, as these patterns shift, community or professional care institutions may increasingly become the mainstream, potentially moving the responsibility of care from the private dinner table to the public square. It is a transition that offers more independence for some, but for others it may simply feel like another way of being left behind. If the social contract of care shifts from the private dinner table to the public square, we have to ask, where does that care actually happen? For many, the answer is here. The concept of aging in place. The preference to live independently in one's own home as one grows older is often framed as a matter of logistics or economics. But for the people living it, it is deeply tied to the question of identity. In a qualitative study of older adults in Madrid, researchers found that staying in a familiar environment provides a sense of emotional continuity. They described this as a way to avoid the rupture that often comes with old age, that sudden, jarring break where a person is uprooted from their life and moved into a facility or a new, unfamiliar setting. This attachment to a local space isn't just about the four walls of a house. The study suggests it has two interwoven layers. There is the private space of the home, where our personal history is anchored, and the social space of the neighborhood, where we are recognized by the people we pass on the street. When these layers are intact, the environment acts as a stabilizer. But how we maintain that stability and how we define ourselves through it depends heavily on where we are in the world. In Taiwan, for example, researchers found that housing decisions are deeply relational. Identity is often place-based, rooted in ancestral property ties and the complex web of intergenerational reciprocity. Here, control over one's living situation is tied to family and neighborhood networks, sometimes supplemented by migrant care workers to bridge the gaps in support. But move to Finland, and the logic shifts. In the Finnish context, researchers observed that identity is often something community-built, frequently occurring even after a person has relocated. Control here is more individual, driven by anticipatory planning and an emphasis on accessible housing. Rather than relying on ancestral ties, social support is often fostered through communal housing models that allow for peer reciprocity alongside formal services. This reveals a fundamental tension in how we approach the end of the life cycle. Is identity something we carry within us, something that can be transplanted to a new, modern, efficient apartment in a new city? Or is identity something that is co-authored by our surroundings, a reflection of the specific streets we've walked and the neighbors who know our names? If identity is tied to the social space of a neighborhood, then relocation isn't just a change of address. It is a potential dismantling of the self. As we move toward more institutionalized or communal models of care, we face a difficult trade-off. We may gain the physical safety and medical efficiency of a new environment, but we risk the very thing that makes a life feel continuous. We have to decide if we are designing systems that support people where they are, or systems that simply move them away from who they were. But there is a distinction between being alone and being lonely, and the difference matters for our health. In a 10-year study of over 3,000 adults in England, researchers found that social isolation, the actual lack of social contact, was linked to physical habits. People with fewer social ties were less likely to be physically active and more likely to smoke. Loneliness, which is the subjective, painful feeling of being disconnected, appeared to impact different behaviors. For those who already smoked, loneliness was specifically associated with a harder time quitting. It suggests that while isolation might change what we do with our bodies, loneliness changes how we struggle to change our habits. This sense of being disconnected often goes deeper than just a lack of visitors. It can feel like a loss of place in the world. In a qualitative study of older adults in Hong Kong, participants described a sense of societal alienation. They spoke of a growing distance between themselves and the rest of society, and a feeling that their very identity was disintegrating as they aged. This wasn't just a feeling of sadness, it was a sense of being marginalized, leading to a kind of passivity or even anger and unease about their own vulnerability. When society stops seeing you as a participant and starts seeing you as a recipient of care, the social space we discussed earlier begins to shrink. As we look for ways to bridge that gap, there is a lot of optimism around smart care technology. The idea is that sensors, tablets, and digital interfaces can keep people connected and monitored without requiring them to leave their homes. Evidence from a study in China's Yangtze River Delta between 2018 and 2023 suggests this can work. In urban areas where the digital infrastructure is strong, smart technology helped reduce social isolation for elders living alone by encouraging them to participate in their communities and better manage their own health. But these technological fixes aren't a universal cure, and they come with significant caveats. The benefits aren't distributed equally. The data showed that these tools were most effective for the younger elderly, those in their mid-60s to mid-70s, who are more comfortable with digital interfaces. There is a real risk that relying on these systems could actually deepen the marginalization of the most vulnerable, the oldest old, or those with low literacy levels who may find themselves even more isolated by a world that has moved online without them. So, as we move toward a future of automated care, we face a new kind of tension. Technology might be able to monitor a heartbeat or facilitate a video call, but it cannot easily replace the sense of being a recognized, participating member of a community. If we design our systems to prioritize medical efficiency through a screen, we have to ask if we are truly solving isolation or if we are simply digitizing it. There is a deeper, more structural tension at play. As our bodies and our societies change, the very math we use to organize our lives begins to shift. We often talk about the aging population as a demographic statistic, but for a modern economy, it represents a fundamental change in how wealth and labor move through a country. In China, for example, researchers have been tracking this shift through the China Health and Retirement Longitudinal Study. Looking at data from 2011 to 2020, they've seen a trend that many nations are now facing. As a population ages, the labor supply tends to shrink while the costs of supporting that population go up. This creates a difficult loop. Economic growth is often the very foundation that keeps social security systems solvent, but that growth is itself pressured by the changing demographics. It's a delicate balance. If the economic engine slows, the ability to provide welfare and protection for the elderly can falter. And protection means different things depending on who you ask. If you look at the data on what we call active aging, a term used to describe how people stay healthy, socially connected, and economically secure, the picture is complicated. In China, while overall levels of active aging improved over that decade, the benefits weren't shared equally. While some regions saw gaps narrow, others, in the east, the northeast, and the west, actually saw the divide widen. Factors like where you live, your level of education, and whether you are married or living in a city all played a massive role in how well a person could stay active and engaged. This brings us to a tension between the economic and the human. If we focus purely on the economic sustainability of pensions and social security, we risk treating aging as a math problem to be solved, a matter of managing costs and labour shortages. But for the millions of people living with disabilities or chronic conditions, the conversation isn't about managing a demographic, it's about human rights. It's about whether a society that is increasingly preoccupied with economic efficiency can still guarantee the dignity and the participation of those who can no longer contribute to the workforce in traditional ways. This tension eventually leads us to a much more radical and much more controversial frontier, the idea that we shouldn't be managing aging at all, but rather trying to defeat it. Most of our social, legal, and economic systems are built on the assumption that death is an inevitable, natural part of the human cycle. But some philosophers argue that this acceptance is a cultural habit rather than a biological necessity. Ingemar Patrick Linden, for instance, argues that death is, quite simply, evil. He suggests that we are approaching a new era where science might treat aging not as a natural progression, but as a curable illness. Linden's argument is a provocative one. He pushes back against the common justifications for mortality, the ideas that death prevents overpopulation or that life extension would simply lead to boredom. Instead, he frames the pursuit of radical life extension as an optimistic project, arguing that the very badness of death is actually a reflection of how much we value life. It's a debate that forces us to look at the intersection of everything we've discussed. If we solve the biological problem of aging through science, we might change what it means to be human. But in doing so, we would also fundamentally break every economic and social system we have currently built to manage the reality of a finite life. We are left wondering, can we build a world that is economically sustainable, humanely inclusive, and biologically transformative all at once? Or are we simply trying to solve one crisis by creating another?